1944, June 26. Saipan, Marianas Islands, northern coastline, 0310. The wind came off the ocean like something angry. It didn't whisper. It didn't carry the soft salt smell of open water the way Private Thomas Ellery remembered from the fishing pier back home in Gloucester. This wind scraped. It moved through the shattered palm trunks and the broken sugarcane with a low grinding moan, like a door on a rusted hinge that someone kept pushing and never quite closed. Ellery pressed his back harder against the limestone and felt the rock cold through his dungaree jacket, felt the damp coral grit press into the fabric and through it, and told himself to breathe. Below him, 60 feet below him, maybe 70, the black Pacific smashed itself against the base of the cliff in rhythmic, indifferent explosions of white foam. He could hear it even over the wind, especially over the wind. The kind of sound that filled the spaces between heartbeats and reminded a man without any ceremony exactly how far down the world went. He didn't look. He'd looked once, when they first reached the cliff line 3 hours ago, and that had been enough. He kept his eyes on the terrain in front of him instead. The broken ground, the collapsed tree line, the pale limestone outcroppings that jutted from the hillside like the ribs of something enormous that had died here long before any of them arrived. He kept his M1 across his knees, his thumb on the safety, and he watched. Sergeant Dolan was 4 feet to his left, a shape more than a man in the darkness. Beyond Dolan, Private Reyes. Beyond Reyes, Corporal Watts. 4 men on a ledge above the ocean at the northern tip of an island that was supposed to have been secured 2 weeks ago. It had not been secured. This is a first-person war story, set in the Pacific Theater, 1944, at Saipan in the final days of the island campaign, following a Marine rifleman pressed to the northern cliffs with nowhere left to fall. You'll live through the last gasp of a surrounded perimeter, the night a human wave comes out of the dark, and the moment the cliff stops being a position and becomes a choice. But the moment that decides everything is not a Japanese soldier. It's a child's voice coming from a cave. And what happens when it stops? Ellery had been on Saipan for 22 days. He had aged, by his own private accounting, somewhere between 10 and 40 years. The math didn't matter. What mattered was what he knew now that he hadn't known when they crossed the reef on June 15th in the Amtraks, taking fire before the ramp dropped, losing men before they'd ever touched dry ground. He knew that islands were liars. They looked finite on the maps. Small, bounded, comprehensible, and then you were inside them and they became infinite. Every cave a new interior, every ridgeline a new wall. The island did not run out. It just kept producing new places to die. The 2nd Marine Division had pushed north for 3 weeks. They'd taken Mount Tapachau. They'd cracked the Kagman Peninsula. They'd driven the Japanese army, and what remained of the civilian population ahead of them, like water before a slow broom, north and always north, until north ran out, until the ground ended, and the only thing beyond was the ocean and the wind. Now there was no more north. Ellery shifted his weight and felt the limestone scrape against his left heel through the worn sole of his boot. Both boots had split along the welt sometime around day 14. He'd wrapped them with strips of canvas cut from a shelter half, and they'd held, more or less, though the improvised soles absorbed water like sponges and never fully dried. His feet were the color of old paper and wrinkled to the knuckle, the way hands looked after an hour in a washtub. He'd stopped noticing the discomfort sometime around day 18. The body, he had learned, was remarkably adaptive. It simply reclassified things that would have been emergencies back home, pain, cold, wet, hunger, into the new category of normal, and kept functioning. It was only the mind that had trouble making that adjustment. He reached into his breast pocket and found the last cigarette in his last pack, flattened but intact, and put it between his lips without lighting it. He didn't want to smoke it. He just wanted it there. The familiar paper and tobacco smell, something ordinary. Then he heard it, from somewhere down the cliff face. From one of the cave openings that pocked the limestone like empty eye sockets, came the sound of a child crying, not screaming, not the sharp, animal shriek of sudden pain. This was the low, exhausted, almost silent crying of a child who had been crying for a long time and had run out of the energy for anything louder. A thin, reedy sound, barely audible under the wind, and then gone, then back, then gone again. Dolan's head turned toward it in the dark. Ellery saw the movement more than the man. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. They'd been hearing civilian sounds for days, voices, crying, occasionally singing in Japanese that carried up from the caves at odd hours, and they'd learned not to follow the sounds. The caves were threaded with soldiers. The civilians and the military had collapsed together into the same desperate knot, and there was no way to pull one thread without pulling the other. This was something they hadn't trained for, something the maps had not included. The crying faded. The wind replaced it. Ellery put the unlit cigarette back in his pocket and checked his remaining magazines by touch. 3 full, 1 partial. He'd had 7 when they reached this position. The night before last, before they'd pulled back to the cliff line, had been expensive. He didn't think about that night directly. He kept it in the same peripheral place he kept the memory of the view from the cliff's edge. Acknowledged, filed, not examined. Movement, Reyes said, not loud. Barely above breath, Ellery was already looking, 40 yards out, where the broken palms cast irregular shadows even without light. Something moved, not the wind movement of branches. Something lower, something horizontal, a shape that stopped, then moved, then stopped again, with the specific deliberate patience of something that understood it was being watched and didn't care. Dolan raised his fist. Hold. The shape stopped. The wind moved. The ocean pounded below them. Then a flare went up. Not theirs, rising from somewhere behind the Japanese line, with a soft thump, and then a crack of white magnesium light that turned the world into a bleached photograph. And in that flat, shadowless instant, Ellery saw them. Not one shape, not a patrol, dozens of silhouettes moving through the broken ground, spread wide, unhurried, coming forward through the shattered cane and the pale limestone rubble with a steadiness that his brain refused to process as human, because humans moved with uncertainty, with checking, with fear, and these shapes moved the way water moved downhill, with a terrible, indifferent inevitability. The flare died. The dark crashed back. And from behind that darkness, building from somewhere low in the chest of the island itself, came a sound that Ellery had heard about and prayed he never would. A rising human roar, thousands of voices merging into one single exhalation of fury and despair, and it was already much, much closer than the sound of the ocean below. The flare had died 40 seconds ago, and Ellery's eyes still hadn't adjusted. That was the cruelty of flares. The light was so absolute that it burned the dark vision clean out of you, left you temporarily blinder than you'd been before it went up. He pressed his palms flat against the limestone and breathed through his nose and waited for the shapes to come back, for the world to reconstruct itself from the blackness one shadow at a time. Dolan was already moving, low, fast, back along the ledge toward the shallow trench they'd improved over the last 2 days, if you could call scraping at coral with entrenching tools in the dark an improvement. Ellery followed, Reyes and Watts behind him, 4 men moving in a crouch along a cliff edge above 60 feet of black air, with the ocean below and whatever was in front of them still coming, and Ellery kept his eyes on the pale ghost of Dolan's dungaree jacket ahead, and did not look left and did not look down. They dropped into the trench. It was 18 inches deep. It had not seemed shallow when they dug it. It seemed shallow now. How many? Dolan said it flat. Not a question, just an inventory request. Couldn't count. Reyes, too many to count. 40, Ellery said. Minimum, spread wide, maybe 100-yard front. Dolan absorbed this the way he absorbed most information, without visible reaction, without the flinch or the curse that Ellery would have permitted himself in private. He reached for the radio handset and keyed it once, twice, and got static. He adjusted the squelch and tried again. This time a voice came back, distant and fractured, and Dolan turned his body to block the sound and spoke into it in a low, flat monotone that communicated everything through tone alone, without saying anything useful in plain language over an open frequency. Ellery used the time to press himself against the forward wall of the trench and look out over the ground. His eyes were coming back. The landscape resolved slowly. The broken cane, the limestone outcrops, the collapsed palm trunks lying at angles like the debris of a storm that had hit years ago and never been cleaned up. He could see perhaps 30 yards in the moonless dark, maybe 35. The shapes he'd seen in the flare light were somewhere beyond that threshold. Moving, coming. The thing about Saipan, that the maps had never communicated, that no map could communicate, was how compressed it all was. Back in the staging areas, back on the transports, the maps had made the island look like a problem with a solution. You could see the shape of it, the dimensions, the terrain features labeled with names that made them sound navigable. Hill 500, Mount Tapachau, Magician Bay. The names gave the impression of known quantities, manageable distances, a landscape that had been measured and therefore understood. The island itself had not agreed with this assessment. Saipan was 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. Ellery had now walked most of it, crouching, crawling, running, dragging, and it felt larger than any 12-mile by 5-mile space had any right to feel, because the interior was not a flat 12 by 5. It was layered, vertical, the ridgelines stacked behind one another so that clearing one only revealed the next, higher and more entrenched than the last. The caves ran through the limestone like a second island hidden inside the first, a parallel geography that didn't appear on any map because no marine had gone in to measure it and come back out with the numbers. You learned the island by moving through it and by getting hit in places you hadn't thought to defend, and by the time you understood a piece of terrain well enough to use it, you were already past it and somewhere worse. The 2nd Marines had learned this lesson 22 days running. Now Dolan pulled the handset away from his ear and turned back. Fox Company is 300 yards south. They're getting it too. Same front, same spread. He paused. Battalion thinks it's the main push. Battalion is 300 yards south, Watts said. That's what I said. Watts made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else, and went back to watching his sector. The thing about being 300 yards from support was that 300 yards in daylight on open ground was nothing. A minute's jog, the length of 3 football fields. 300 yards at night across broken coral terrain with a banzai front somewhere between you and them was a different unit of measurement entirely. It was a number that meant you were alone. Ellery had known this was coming. Not tonight specifically, not this exact hour, but the general shape of it. He'd known since the first time he stood near the northern cliff edge and looked at the shrinking belt of ground between their perimeter and the ocean behind them. You didn't need to be a tactician to understand what a shrinking perimeter meant. You just needed to be able to read terrain the way men who'd been under fire for 3 weeks learned to read it, with the part of the brain that had stopped processing beauty or history and now processed only angles, cover, distance, and escape. There was no escape here. That was the geological fact. North was ocean. South was the Japanese pushing from their last consolidated positions in the caves and the draws and the broken ridgelines. East and west were also ocean. Saipan was not a wide island, and at the northern tip it narrowed down to a limestone peninsula barely 400 yards across. The Marines on this ground were not holding a front. They were holding the last square footage of the island that hadn't been contested, and they were holding it with their backs to the cliff. The maps had made this look like a tactical problem. Standing in it, it felt like a mathematical certainty. Dolan said, "Ammo check. Quick." They went through it fast, voices barely above breath, passing the numbers down the line and back. Ellery had his 3 full magazines and the partial. Dolan had 4 and a partial. Reyes had 2 full and 2 partials. Watts had 3. No grenades between them. They'd expended the last ones 2 nights ago in the draw below Hill 20, when the infiltration had come through the gap they hadn't known existed. That was the other lesson Saipan had taught. There was always a gap you hadn't known existed. The terrain that looked clear from the map, that looked clear from the ridge above, turned out when you were inside it to contain a fold, a draw, a shallow cave mouth, a depression in the sugarcane, just deep enough to swallow men single file and keep them invisible until they were close enough to use knives. The island was full of these features. They didn't appear on maps. They appeared as casualties. Race touched Ellery's arm. 2 fingers pointing left. 40 yards. Lower than the tree line. Ellery looked. There, yes. A shape moving parallel to their trench, not toward them, moving laterally, scouting the line, feeling for the edge of the position. He watched it stop behind an outcrop and stay still, and the stillness was worse than the movement because it meant thinking. It meant someone over there deciding something. Dolan had seen it too. He did not fire. Firing would illuminate their position and their numbers and their gaps, and right now the darkness was the only thing still working in their favor. The shape stayed behind the outcrop. 30 seconds. A minute. The wind moved through the broken palms with its low, grinding moan, and the ocean below kept its rhythm. Crash, exhale, crash, exhale. Indifferent to all of it, and Ellery found himself thinking, involuntarily, absurdly, about his mother's kitchen in Gloucester on a November morning, the smell of coffee, and the sound of the radio turned low, the window over the sink fogged with condensation from the cold outside. The mind went there sometimes without permission. It went looking for something survivable. He pulled it back, checked his sight line, watched the outcrop. Then, from somewhere along the left flank, 30 yards past Reyes, in the section of ground where there was supposed to be no gap, where 2 days ago they'd pulled together the wire and stacked the rocks and told themselves it was solid, came the soft, precise sound of wire being parted. Not cut, parted. Pushed aside carefully. The way you moved through something when you'd done it before and knew exactly where the tension points were. Somebody had been watching them lay that wire. The draw smelled of sulfur and wet limestone and something organic. He'd stopped trying to name 3 weeks ago. The cane on either side was dead, drought-killed, the stalks dry and brittle, which meant moving through it was impossible without noise, so he stayed on the bare coral floor and moved in a half-crouch, each step placed deliberately, his rifle up, his thumb resting against the safety without pressing it. 20 yards into the draw, Ellery found the first one. The Japanese soldier was pressed into a crevice in the right wall. A natural indent in the limestone, maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Absolutely still. If the moonlight had been hitting the draw from a different angle, if Ellery had been 6 inches to the left, he would have passed within arm's reach without seeing him. But the angle was what it was, and he caught the faint gleam of equipment, a buckle, a rifle barrel, and stopped. For a half-second they were both still. Then the soldier came out of the crevice fast and low, leading with the bayonet, and Ellery stepped left, and the blade scraped his forearm without penetrating, more pressure than cut, and they collided at the shoulder. He got his left hand on the rifle barrel and pushed it down and drove his elbow back and felt it connect with something that gave jaw or collarbone, and the man went sideways. He didn't let go of the barrel. He stepped into the man's space and drove again, and this time the man went all the way down and didn't come back up. Ellery stood over him, breathing. From deeper in the draw came a single rifle crack. Then a burst of noise, bodies colliding, a short guttural shout cut off quickly, then silence. Then Dolan's voice, low and controlled. "Clear, come up." The draw bent around a limestone outcrop and opened into a wider bowl, 20 yards across, surrounded on 3 sides by walls rising 8 to 10 feet. In the center, half sheltered by an overhang, was a cave mouth, not large, 4 feet wide, 3 feet high at the entrance, widening back into blackness. The kind of opening you entered on hands and knees. The kind that could kill everyone inside it before the first man got his feet through. Reyes was kneeling at the cave mouth with his hand raised. Stop. From inside, some distance inside, impossible to judge, came shuffling movement. Not the controlled quiet of soldiers repositioning, something with no tactical purpose. Several people in a small space, moving without plan. Dolan crouched at the mouth and listened. Ellery watched his face and found nothing useful in it. Dolan reached into his jacket and produced a fragmentation grenade. He held it up and made eye contact with both of them in sequence, a question and an answer at once. Reyes held up a fist. "Wait." He tilted his head. "Listen." Ellery listened too. Past the shuffle of movement, past the wind, past his own heartbeat, something else. Something the brain flagged automatically, and that bypassed tactical assessment entirely, going straight to something older, a child's breathing. The ragged, congested breathing of a child who had cried for a long time and fallen into exhausted sleep. Reyes looked at Dolan. Dolan looked at the grenade. He put it back in his jacket. He stood and moved away from the cave mouth, and neither of them said anything, and the decision they'd made together without speaking sat in the air between them like a third presence without name, without resolution. They were 5 yards from the cave when the shot came from above. It came from the top of the limestone wall on the south side of the bowl, a position Ellery had checked and catalogued as empty. It had not been empty. The round hit Reyes in the left shoulder and spun him to one knee, and before the echo finished bouncing off the walls, Dolan was returning fire at the muzzle flash and Ellery was already dragging Reyes by the collar, because the bowl was a kill zone. The cave and the sniper above it were working together, and they had been inside this trap for 30 seconds without knowing it. The second shot hit Coral 6 inches from Ellery's boot, spraying fragments that stung his ankle through the canvas wrapping. He didn't stop dragging. They came around the outcrop into the draw, and Ellery pressed Reyes against the wall, got his hand inside the jacket over the wound. The blood was warm and immediate. He pressed hard with his palm and Reyes hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out, the routine kind of courage nobody wrote down. "Through and through," Ellery said, feeling the exit. "Hit bone. Stay still." "I'm still," Reyes said. He was shaking, but he was still. From somewhere above, through the limestone wall, came voices. Not shouting, deliberate, controlled, moving laterally through the rock in a direction that intersected with the draw somewhere ahead of them. They hadn't walked into a cave. They'd walked into the back entrance of a connected position, and whatever moved through the limestone above was already working around to the front. "Back to the trench," Dolan said. They moved. They were halfway back to the wire when Watts met them coming the other direction. Eyes wide, rifle up. He said 3 words that rearranged everything. "They're inside already." Inside already. Ellery processed those 2 words, the way you processed a round coming through a wall. Not intellectually, not with analysis, but with the body, which understood threat faster than the mind did, and was already moving before the mind caught up. He shifted Reyes's weight onto Dolan and came up with his rifle and looked past Watts toward the trench they'd left 4 minutes ago. The trench was 30 yards away. He could see one end of it, the left end, where they'd stacked 2 limestone slabs as a rough firing parapet. One of the slabs had been moved. He could see the gap it left, pale against the darker ground, the kind of detail that only registered when something that had been one way was now another way. "How many?" he said. 2 that I saw. Maybe 3. Came through the south end while I was watching north." Watts's voice had the flat, over-controlled quality of a man keeping panic below the surface through deliberate effort. "I pulled back when I heard them drop in. Didn't engage, didn't want to take fire from both sides. That had been the right call. Ellery didn't say so, because there wasn't time." Dolan had Reyes's good arm over his shoulder and was doing the math with the same visible absence of expression he brought to everything. He looked at the trench. He looked at the ground between them and it. He looked at Watts. "Suppression," he said. "Left side. Ellery takes right. We push through." It was not a complicated plan. It was the only plan available, which was the circumstance that produced most plans in Ellery's experience. You had a position you needed to reclaim, men inside it you needed to remove, and a wounded man you needed to get into cover, and those 3 facts arranged themselves into a sequence whether you wanted them to or not. Ellery moved right, angling wide to come at the trench from the flank, using the scattered outcrops as cover. The coral was uneven and invisible in the dark, and twice his boot caught the edge of something. He adjusted without stopping, the reflexive balance of a man who had been moving across bad ground for 3 weeks. 15 yards from the trench he stopped and looked. 2 figures in the trench, both crouched at the forward wall, both watching south, using the Marines' own position to watch for the Marines. They hadn't checked behind them. That was the calculation Dolan had made, and it was correct. Ellery aligned himself with the right end of the trench and waited for Watts to open up on the left. The firing started and Ellery moved. He covered 15 yards fast, came in at the trench end rather than over the wall where they'd be looking, dropped in at the right end while the figures were turning toward Watts's fire, and the next 12 seconds were the kind of 12 seconds you didn't reconstruct afterward in any linear way. They existed in memory as fragments, a face turning toward him, the bark and recoil of his M1 twice, the smell of burnt powder and something metallic, a body against the forward wall that had stopped being a threat, the second man going over the back wall and not returning. Then Dolan was dropping in beside him with Reyes, and the trench was theirs again, and Ellery stood with his back against the rear wall and breathed. His hands were not shaking. He noted this without judgment. They had stopped shaking sometime around day 8. He was not sure whether this represented an improvement. Reyes went down against the rear wall, and Ellery pressed his last field dressing, torn undershirt, wrapped around folded map paper against the entrance wound, and used Reyes's good hand to hold it. "Keep pressure. Don't let go for any reason." "I won't," Reyes said. His voice was steady. His color was not good. Dolan was on the radio. Ellery listened with one ear while watching the ground in front, what he assembled from one side of the exchange. Fox Company was engaged. Baker Company had lost their left platoon and pulled their line east. The perimeter was contracting. Battalion had confirmed this was the main assault, the last coordinated offensive the Japanese forces on Saipan had the men to mount. After this, there would be nothing left to mount. He understood this in the abstract way you understood things that were simultaneously obvious and impossible to fully absorb. The Japanese garrison was finished. The island was finished. Every man in those caves knew this, had known it perhaps since the landing on June 15th when the scale of the invasion force made the arithmetic of the defense self-evident. And yet here they came anyway, coming in a direction that had nowhere to go, against a line backed against the ocean, at a time when the outcome was already decided. It was not about winning. Ellery had come to understand this. He didn't have a word for what it was about, but it was not winning. Then Watts said quietly, "Left front, 40 yards." They came out of the sugarcane in a cluster. 5, then 6, then more. And they were not soldiers. The way they moved told him that before anything else, no tactical spacing, no weapons up. They moved the way frightened people moved, close together, lurching forward in starts and stops, the ones in front pulling up and the ones behind walking into them, civilians, Chamorros or Japanese colonists. He couldn't tell at this distance, mixed men and women, one figure small enough to be a child. Most of their hands were up. Behind them, at the cane line, a figure in uniform. The uniformed figure was not pointing a weapon at the civilians. He stood with his rifle at his side, watching them move toward the Marine trench, and Ellery could not read his intention from here. Driving them as a screen, waiting to see what happened. Advancing behind the confusion of their approach. All of these were possible. None of them were the same thing. "Hold," Dolan said. 25 yards. A woman in a dark dress, with her hair loose, saw Ellery's helmet above the parapet and froze completely, the full-body stillness of a creature that had assessed a threat and could not determine which direction to run. The people behind her walked into her, and she stumbled and caught herself, and looked at the trench, and then looked back at the cane line where the uniformed figure stood watching. She was caught between two armies. She knew it. She couldn't make her legs choose. The small figure, the child, detached from the group and ran toward the trench, not toward the uniformed figure, toward the Marines. Small legs churning across coral ground with the desperate, uncalculating speed of a child running toward any adult in the absence of safety, running before anything else, running because the body was too young to be paralyzed by adult assessment. Ellery was half out of the trench before he knew he was moving. Dolan grabbed his jacket collar. "Ellery, kids alone. You go over that wall." The crack of a round hitting limestone 4 inches above the parapet ended the discussion. Not from the cane line, from the right, from the rocky slope east of their position, from a direction they hadn't been watching. A sniper who had been waiting for exactly this, for someone to present a target. The child hit the ground 10 yards short of the trench. Ellery's heart seized. Then the child moved. Hands and knees, crawling, continuing forward, unhurt, the fall a stumble, not a wound, and he let the breath out. But the woman in the dark dress was still frozen, and the uniformed figure had taken a step forward. And from the south, running feet on coral, a messenger from Fox Company arriving at a dead sprint and dropping into the trench beside Dolan, breathing too hard to speak for 3 full seconds before the words came. "They're massing," he said. "Not a raid. Something bigger." Dolan looked at the messenger, looked at the civilians caught in the open, looked at the sniper ground to the east, looked at the cane line where the uniformed figure waited with the patient, indecipherable stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for the right moment. "How long?" Dolan said. The messenger shook his head. "Minutes." Dolan looked at the child still crawling across the open ground, moving with an animal persistence that had nothing to do with bravery, because bravery required understanding danger, and the child was too young to fully understand this one. "Get the kid," Dolan said to Ellery. "Then don't go past the parapet." Ellery went over the wall. He went over the wall, and the world became very simple. There was the child, 10 yards ahead, still crawling. There was the sniper somewhere on the eastern slope who had fired once and might fire again. There was the coral ground between Ellery and the child, pale and broken and offering nothing in the way of cover between the trench wall behind him and the child in front. And there was the distance, 10 yards going, 10 yards coming back. Ellery ran. He moved in a crouch, and then, 4 steps out, abandoned the crouch entirely because crouching slowed him and the sniper's last shot had been aimed high anyway, at the parapet, at a helmet. He ran fully upright and angled left and closed the distance in the time it took his heart to beat 4 times, and he hit the ground beside the child and gathered the small body against his chest in one motion and turned back and ran again. The child was a girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. She made no sound when he grabbed her, no cry, no struggle, just went rigid with the total body tension of a small animal caught by something larger. And then 2 steps into the run back, she grabbed his jacket with both fists and held on with a grip that surprised him with its strength. Her face was against his shoulder. He could feel her breathing fast against his neck. rapid and shallow, the breathing of extreme fear. But she held on and she didn't make a sound. No shot came. He dropped back into the trench and set the girl down against the rear wall beside Reyes, who looked at her and then looked at Ellery with an expression there wasn't time to interpret. The girl looked at Reyes, at the blood on his jacket, at his face, and still said nothing. She pulled her knees to her chest and made herself small, and watched everything with eyes that were too old for her face. Ellery looked over the parapet. The woman in the dark dress had gone down on her knees 20 yards out, either from fear or from something physical. The other civilians were scattered, some back toward the cane, some flat on the ground, one man still walking forward with his hands up as though the gesture alone could negotiate a safe path through all of this. The uniformed figure at the cane line was gone. Dolan pulled Ellery close and spoke low. "When it comes, it's going to come fast and wide. They're not trying to reduce a position. They're trying to go through us." Ellery understood what that meant. A reducing force worked methodically, cleared the flanks, suppressed the center, advanced by stages. A force trying to go through came all at once on a wide front and accepted casualties on the approach because the objective wasn't survival, it was penetration. You couldn't out-clever a charge like that. You could only make the ground in front of the trench expensive enough that the momentum ran out before it reached you. "Mag count," Dolan said. 3 full, 1 partial. I've got 4 and a partial. Watts has 3. He paused. "It's not enough." The understatement was itself a kind of communication. Dolan was not a man who stated obvious things for emphasis. He stated things because they needed to be in the open, acknowledged between them. 4 men, one of them wounded, on a ledge above the ocean with 11 magazines between them, and a wide front assault assembling in the broken ground to the south. Ellery reached into his jacket and touched the unlit cigarette in his breast pocket. Still there, paper slightly flattened. He left it where it was. The girl against the wall was watching him. He looked at her once and she didn't look away. Not the expression of a child frightened into blankness, but something specific. The expression of a child paying close attention to the adults around her and assessing, with whatever years she had, whether they were going to be able to handle what was coming. He didn't know how to reassure her. He didn't try. Reyes spoke from the wall. "My arm's gone numb." "That's the shock," Ellery said. "Keep the pressure." "I know. I'm keeping it." A pause. "I just wanted someone to know." "I know," Ellery said. The sound from the south changed. Not louder, quieter. The individual exchanges of fire were spacing out, and the voices were dropping, and there was a new quality to the air that was not a sound at all but a pressure, a sense of held breath, of mass exhalation suspended. Then, from the south and slightly east, rhythmic, almost musical, men's voices, many of them finding a cadence together, not march time, not song, but something between them, something that served to synchronize many bodies into a single organism, to dissolve individual fear into collective direction. Then the drums, small, carried drums, beating a simple pattern, 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause, and the voices rising with them. The sound came from a wide arc now, not a point, which meant a wide front, which confirmed what the messenger had told them. Dozens of men at minimum, possibly hundreds, moving toward the last few hundred yards of contested ground on this island, with everything they had left. The roar started low. It built the way a wave built, gathering from a distance, pulling volume from depth, and by the time it was close, it was no longer possible to distinguish individual voices inside it. One sound, a single continuous human sound that had no analog in anything Ellery had known before this island, and that the body responded to on a level below thought, below training, below everything, the ancient part of the nervous system that knew, without being told, what it meant when that many voices combined in that particular way. Dolan's hand was on Ellery's shoulder. "Whatever happens," he said, "you hold this trench." The darkness in front of them broke open. They came through the broken cane and the limestone rubble and the dark all at once, and the first thing Ellery understood was the scale of it, not from counting, because you could not count in that first instant, but from the sound of feet on coral, which was a continuous percussive roar that came from too wide a front to be a patrol or a company-sized element. It was the sound of a great number of men in motion and committed, and it arrived in the same second the shapes resolved out of the dark and Ellery's M1 was up and he was firing before the rational mind had completed any sentence about what to do. The M1 Garand held 8 rounds in a clip. 8 rounds, semi-automatic. and when the last round fired, the clip ejected with a distinctive metallic ping that was, in normal circumstances, the signal to reload. Tonight the ping came and his hand went to the belt, and he had the new clip seated and the bolt rammed home and was firing again before he had consciously registered the reload at all. The body had learned this. The body did it without asking. Dolan was firing on his left, Watts on his right. 3 men working the front in overlapping sectors the way they'd trained for it. The discipline of assigned sectors preventing them from all shooting at the same target while something else came through an unwatched angle. The discipline held for the first 30 seconds, and then the shapes were at the wire, and some of them were going down and some were not, and the ones that were not came over the wire at a run. The first man over the wire hit the parapet, and Ellery drove the butt of his M1 into the man's chest, and the man went back over. The second came from the right, and Dolan took him. The third came straight down into the trench, and Watts met him with his elbow and they rolled against Ellery's boots, and Watts came up, and that problem was resolved. And then there were more at the parapet, and the 3-man line was no longer a line. It was a series of individual engagements happening simultaneously in a space too small for the number of bodies now occupying it. This was what they had not trained for. Training had sequences. Training had an if-then structure the mind could follow. Combat at this range and this density had no sequence. It had only the next 3 seconds, and then the 3 seconds after that, and the mind that tried to plan past 3 seconds was the mind that got its owner killed while it was busy planning. He fired twice at a shape coming over the left parapet and pivoted right, and there was a man already in the trench, and Ellery was too close for the rifle. He got his left forearm up and blocked the first swing, and something hit his right cheekbone, fist or heel of a hand, and his vision went white for a half-second. He stepped into the man rather than back, which was the counterintuitive thing training had put there, and his body had now accepted as correct. Close distance neutralized the weapon. He got both hands on the man, and they hit the trench wall, and the man went still. He straightened, checked 3 directions. Trench momentarily clear, slapped in his last full magazine. The partial already half gone. Dolan was firing east, not south, which meant the eastern slope where the sniper had been was now also producing contact. The assault had come from south and east simultaneously, not sequential. Planned. They'd been held in position for the flanking push to develop while the frontal assault drew all the attention and all the available thought, and now the trench that had 2 directions of threat 30 minutes ago had 4. Watts, Ellery said. Watts didn't answer. Ellery looked left. Watts was sitting against the rear wall, and the way he was sitting, the specific angle of his shoulders and the position of his head, told Ellery something he filed without examining and would not examine until later, when there was time. He looked at the girl, still pressed into the corner, knees to her chest, face turned into the limestone. The instinct of small animals to go motionless when the world became incomprehensibly dangerous had served her. He had nothing better to offer. Reyes was on his feet, upright with his back against the rear wall and his rifle in his one functional hand, stock braced against his hip, face pale and set and concentrated, watching the parapet. The focused attention of a man who had decided he was going to be useful for whatever time he had remaining to be useful in, and Ellery felt something pass through him at the sight of it that he had no words for. South end, Reyes said. 3 more coming. Ellery turned south. Fired twice. 1 went down. 2 kept coming. Fired again, and his M1 pinged. Clip empty. He reached for the partial, and his hand closed on nothing. Gone. Dropped in the scramble, or expended without accounting in the chaos. He had a Ka-bar on his belt. He had a rifle he could use as a club. He had a trench 18 inches deep above the ocean. The 2 shapes came over the wire. Dolan appeared from the right end of the trench at a dead sprint, covering 30 feet in 3 seconds, and hit both shapes with his rifle at the parapet, and they went over together, and Dolan came back to his feet and looked at Ellery, and Ellery showed him the empty cartridge belt with his hands, and Dolan reached into his jacket and came out with 1 clip, single clip, and handed it over without a word. Ellery loaded. Dawn was coming. He could feel it before he could see it, a slight theoretical lightening at the eastern edge of the sky, more absence of dark than actual light. The cliff wind dropped 1 degree. The ocean below shifted from black to the darkest possible gray. In that first gray light, he saw the ground in front of the trench clearly for the first time since the assault began. He looked at it for a long moment. He was not a man who had been sheltered from the cost of what had happened on this island. But the ground in front of the trench in the first gray light of July 7, 1944, was something he had not seen before, and he understood that the visual record his mind was making would not be one he could stop retrieving when he didn't want it. He looked away. He looked at Dolan. "They're pulling back," Dolan said. "What's left of them?" The perimeter behind them had contracted further. The ground they'd been holding, the ground that was already the last ground, was now the only ground. No left, no right, only the trench and whatever remained between it and the ocean. "The cliff line," Ellery said. Dolan nodded once. Ellery looked at Reyes, still standing. Looked at the girl, still watching him with those old, attentive eyes. Looked at Watts against the left wall, and this time he let himself look, and he understood what he was looking at, and he put it in the place where the mind kept the things it wasn't ready to carry openly. And then, from the south, from the direction of the broken perimeter, from the gray and smoking distance of a Saipan morning, came a sound with no tactical content and no military significance that hit Ellery in the chest like something physical, a woman's voice, singing, low and continuous, in Japanese. The melody that mothers used before the words mattered, when the sound itself was the message. Somewhere in the gray light and the broken cane, the woman in the dark dress was alive and singing. The child in the corner had not made a sound in 40 minutes because she had been listening for exactly that voice, holding very still so she could hear it. The girl's hands released from around her knees. We won the trench, but the perimeter behind us was gone, and the only order left was to fall back to the cliff. And the cliff wasn't a line. The cliff was the end. They moved north with the dawn at their backs and the ocean in front of them, and the island still firing. Not a route, a movement under contact, which was a different thing. A route was disorganized, every man for himself, momentum overcoming tactics. What Dolan held together was something harder, a withdrawal with discipline, covering each other, moving in pairs, one man watching the rear while the other moved and then reversing it. The basic grammar of infantry survival applied to a situation that was doing everything it could to dissolve that grammar into chaos. Ellery had Reyes on his right side, arm across his shoulders, and the weight was considerable. Reyes was taller and had always outweighed him, but the weight was also an anchor, something concrete to move toward a purpose, and Ellery found that he was grateful for it. The girl walked on her own. She was between Ellery and Dolan, and she moved with a quick, precise step that kept pace without guidance, as though her legs understood the direction, even if no one had explained the destination. She had not spoken. Since Ellery had pulled her over the trench wall, she had not produced a single sound he could remember. She watched, and she moved, and she held the pace. That was all she offered, and it was more than most could manage. The ground between the trench and the cliff line was 200 yards of broken limestone and shattered palm, coral rubble and shallow draws, and the detritus of 3 weeks of fighting, compressed into a space that had never been large to begin with. Other Marines were moving through it, shapes and fragments of squads working north through the same broken terrain, some helping wounded, some alone, the disorganized remnant of a perimeter that had held longer than it had any right to hold. To the south and east, the firing was still continuous, not the banzai front that had spent itself against the Marine lines, and the mathematics had eventually resolved, as mathematics always did, though the resolution had cost more than 11 magazines and 1 man in a trench. The firing now was the grinding, unrelenting fire of cave positions threaded through the limestone in ways that no assault and no flamethrower had been able to fully address. The island had teeth. It kept demonstrating this. 50 yards from the cliff edge, Ellery heard the civilians, not the woman singing. That voice had carried for a while and then stopped, and he didn't know what that meant and was not going to know for some time. These were different voices, a group, coming from a draw that angled down toward the northern coastline, moving in the same general direction but faster, less controlled, with the specific urgent sound of people driven forward by something that their own fear was amplifying rather than slowing. There were perhaps 20 of them. Men, women, several children, an elderly man supported by 2 younger women, Chamorros and Japanese civilians both, mixed together the way the final days of the island had mixed everything. The distinctions of the occupation collapsed by the common emergency of being caught between 2 armies on ground that was running out. They moved past the Marines without slowing, eyes fixed on something ahead, going north. He knew where they were going. The same direction all of them were going. North. The cliff. What he didn't know What he had been trying not to think about, with the deliberate effort of a man who had learned that some thoughts were not useful until they became unavoidable, was what happened when 20 civilians reached a cliff 60 feet above the ocean with Japanese propaganda in their ears telling them what American soldiers did to prisoners. The interpreters had been working since the landing, calling into the caves with loudspeakers and leaflets, trying to counteract 3 years of occupation. He didn't know how much of it had worked. "We have to get ahead of them," he said to Dolan. Dolan looked at the cliff line, looked at the civilians, looked at Reyes, barely upright. "Move," Dolan said. They moved faster. The cliff wind hit them fully at 30 yards out, cold and direct and smelling of salt and open water, the wind that had been moaning through the broken palms since the beginning of all of this, underneath every other sound on this part of the island for 3 weeks. The cliff edge materialized out of the gray morning. Not a dramatic thing, visually. A line where limestone ended and air began. 60, maybe 70 feet of nothing, and then the black Pacific in the early light, swells running against the base in steady explosions of white. The wind came straight off the water and up the cliff face and hit everything at the edge with a force that was not enough to move a man, but enough to be felt, enough to be a presence. Ellery looked down once, then looked away. He got Reyes down against a limestone outcrop 5 yards back from the edge and checked the wound. The field dressing was soaked through. Reyes's color was worse in daylight, which was the way it usually worked. Darkness was merciful about some things, and dawn removed those mercies one by one. But he was conscious, eyes tracking, breathing steady. "You're going to need a surgeon," Ellery said. "I'm aware," Reyes said, dry as chalk dust. Under the circumstances, the dryness of it was a remarkable thing. The girl sat beside Reyes without being directed to. She looked at his wound with a direct, unsentimental assessment that reminded Ellery of the way Dolan looked at tactical problems, and then she looked at Ellery as though he were the problem she was waiting to see addressed. He took off his jacket and gave it to her. She was shivering. He hadn't noticed until now. She took it without expression and pulled it around her shoulders, 5 sizes too large, and held it closed at the collar with both hands. The civilians reached the cliff line 40 yards west. He saw them arrive at the edge, saw the front of the group stop when the ground ended, saw the ones behind pressing forward and the ones in front pushing back, the whole group compressing at the edge with the physics of a crowd that had run out of forward space. The old man looked down, looked back, and the expression on his face across 40 yards of gray morning was not one Ellery had words for. The expression of a man who had reached the end of something and was performing the final accounting. He was already moving before he decided to move. Dolan caught his arm. "Saito's team is going." The interpreter, a Nisei Marine from the division's language section, was already moving toward the civilians with hands visible, voice rising in Japanese above the wind. "Let him work." Ellery stopped, watched. Saito positioned himself between the group and the cliff edge and spoke. Ellery couldn't hear the words over the distance and the wind, but he could see the effect. The group's forward momentum arrested, the front row looking at this Marine speaking their language, the quality of attention shifting from blind forward pressure to something more uncertain. Uncertain was better than certain. Certain had been taking them toward the edge. 2 women sat down. That was the first sign. When people sat, they were no longer moving toward the edge and they were buying time, and time was the only resource that mattered in this particular transaction. The old man did not sit. He stood at the edge and looked at the ocean for a long time while Saito spoke. He stood on his own, the wind moving his clothing and his white hair, and Ellery watched him and could not look away. Everything on this island had come to this edge. Every decision the island had forced had been trending toward this particular geography. The limestone and the air and the black water below, the choice between what was known and what was feared, between the certainty of the drop and the uncertainty of the Marine speaking your language and offering something he called safety, which you had been told for 3 years was a lie. The old man stepped back from the edge. 1 step. He turned and looked at Saito and said something. And Saito answered. And whatever passed between them was not audible from 40 yards and into the wind, but the old man sat down, and Ellery finally exhaled. The cave shot came from below and to the east, from a position in the cliff face itself, fired upward at an angle that clipped the top of a limestone slab 12 feet to Ellery's right and sent fragments singing past his ear. He was flat before the sound fully registered, and he looked east along the cliff face and understood cave positions below the cliff edge. Not behind them, not to the south, below them. in the limestone face of the cliff itself, firing up and outward, making the cliffline not a safe rear position, but simply another contested ground, which was what Saipan had been making of every position for 22 days, without apology or variation. "Can't suppress it from here," Dolan said. "Angle's wrong." "Hold the line topside," said the lieutenant, appearing beside them, still nameless. "Don't expose to the face," which meant they were holding a cliff line with active firing from below, civilians to the west, cave positions to the south, and one clip between them, and the morning was barely started. The wind moved through the broken palms. The ocean kept its rhythm below. Ellery pressed his back against the limestone, cold through his undershirt now, the jacket gone to the girl, and reached into his breast pocket for the unlit cigarette, and remembered it was in the jacket pocket, and almost laughed, and the almost laugh was near enough to the other thing that he stopped it quickly and put his rifle across his knees and watched his sector. The cliff wasn't a line. The cliff was a finish, and we were standing on it. The firing stopped in stages, not all at once. It never stopped all at once. It thinned. Individual exchanges grew further apart, the silences between them stretching from seconds to minutes, and the minutes accumulating until the last shot from the last cave position to the east cracked against limestone somewhere to the south, and the echo rolled out over the water and died, and then there was only the wind in the ocean and the sound of men breathing. Ellery noticed the silence the way you notice the end of a headache. Not immediately, not with any single moment of recognition, but as a slow arrival of something that was distinguished from what came before it by the absence of pressure. He had been under continuous pressure for so long that the removal of it did not feel like relief. It felt like confusion. His body didn't know what to do with a world that wasn't firing at him, and so it remained in the configuration it had maintained for the last several hours. Low against the limestone, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning, while his mind slowly, tentatively began to accept that the scanning had nothing to find. He became aware of other things. The cold. He had not been cold in hours because the body under sustained stress produced its own heat, the autonomic systems running hot to keep the engine at speed. Now the engine was throttling back, and the cold came through the undershirt, through the thin fabric of his dungaree trousers, up from the limestone ground through his boots, which were still wet, which had been wet since the first day and would be wet until someone found him a dry pair, which would not be today. The cold was thorough and indifferent, and he welcomed it in a way he couldn't have explained because it was a real thing, a present thing, a thing that was happening to him right now and not to the version of him that had been in the trench 2 hours ago. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He had checked this before and found it noteworthy, and he checked it again now and found it less so. The hands that didn't shake anymore were not a sign of strength. They were a sign of something else, something he hadn't settled on a name for yet, and he looked at them for a moment longer and then put them on his rifle and left them there. Dolan came and sat beside him. Not close enough to touch. The right distance, close enough to be present, far enough to allow the silence to remain a private thing for each of them, which was the courtesy men who had been through something offered each other in the aftermath of it. They sat for a while. "Reyes is being moved," Dolan said eventually. "A corpsman had come along the cliff line 20 minutes ago, working east from a collection point somewhere to the west, and had assessed Reyes with the rapid, unsentimental efficiency of a man who had been assessing wounds all night and had developed a very short sorting process. He'd upgraded Reyes's field dressing, marked his forehead with the grease pencil, told him he'd done well keeping the pressure, and moved on. Reyes had watched him go and then looked at Ellery and said nothing, which said enough. "He'll keep the arm?" Ellery asked. Corpsman thought so. A pause. "Didn't promise." Ellery nodded. The difference between will keep and might keep was a difference he understood. The island had taught him the difference between certainties and likelihoods, had been systematic about eliminating the former and leaving only the latter, and he had adapted to this the way he had adapted to most of what the island had taught him, without full acceptance, without protest, in the specific register of a man who continued functioning while internal negotiations about the nature of reality remained unresolved. He looked west along the cliff line. The civilians were still there. Most of them had not moved far from where they'd sat down when Saito worked them back from the edge. They were clustered in a group 20 yards back from the cliff, sitting or lying on the broken ground, and Marine Corpsman and the interpreter and a chaplain Ellery hadn't seen before were moving among them in the slow, careful way you moved among people who had been through something that left the fear close to the surface. The old man was sitting with his back to the cliff and his face to the south, watching the broken terrain the battle had come through, watching it the way a man watched weather, not for what it was now, but for what it might do next. The girl was not with them. Ellery looked at the place beside Resh's outcrop where she had been sitting, jacket pulled around her shoulders, and she was gone. He looked along the cliff line east and west and at the broken ground between the edge and the tray line. He stood up and looked more carefully. She went west, Dolan said. He had been watching, apparently, because that was the kind of man Dolan was. The man who watched while others processed. About 10 minutes ago, toward the civilian group, Ellery looked west, in the cluster of civilians near where Saito was still working. He found her. She was standing at the edge of the group, the two large jackets still around her shoulders, and she was looking at a woman who was sitting on the ground with her knees to her chest and her hair falling loose around her face, a woman in a dark dress, or what had been a dark dress, which was now the color that fabric became after a night of moving through Saipan in the dark. The woman looked up and saw the girl, and her face did a thing that Ellery, 40 yards away and still processing the arithmetic of the night, watched without looking away. The girl walked forward and the woman caught her, and they stayed like that for a long time. The woman's arms around the too large jacket, and the sound that came from that direction was not a sound, Ellery tried to describe to himself. It was the kind of sound that the vocabulary of military life had not supplied a word for. It simply was what it was. It lived in the category of true things, alongside the limestone, and the wind and the weight of 11 magazines and the specific ping of an empty M1 clip at 3 in the morning. He sat back down. He looked at the ocean. The Pacific in early morning light was not the black thing it had been in the dark. It had become something gray-green and vast and indifferent, the swells running from the northwest in long, slow rows that broke against the base of the cliff with a sound that was, now that the firing had stopped, the dominant sound in the world, rhythmic, continuous, older than anything any of them had brought to this island. The horizon was clear. There was no weather coming. The sky above the ocean was the pale, washed blue of a morning that intended to be warm later, a detail that the rest of the scene had no interest in, but that the sky offered anyway, indiscriminately, to the cliff and the marines and the limestone and the dead and the ocean below. 3 weeks ago, Ellery had stood at the railing of a transport ship in this same ocean, looking at this island from the water, and he had felt what had he felt? Not fear exactly. Fear had come later, after the ramp dropped and the coral reef came up with the first rounds already hitting it. Before that, in the transit, in the pre-dawn dark on the water, he had felt something that he might have called anticipation if he were being honest, which he hadn't been able to be about it at the time. The island had looked from the water like a fact, a finite, manageable fact. 12 miles by 5 miles, a problem with dimensions, a thing that could be approached and addressed and resolved. He looked at the island now from the inside of it. It still looked finite. The dimensions were still 12 miles by 5, but the 12 by 5 he now inhabited was a different 12 by 5 than the one he'd seen from the water, and the difference was not a matter of information or experience, though it included both of those. It was a matter of what the 12 miles by 5 miles had done to him, specifically in 22 days of occupying it, the rearrangement it had performed on the interior architecture of his understanding of himself and the world, the rooms it had moved and the walls it had taken down, and the new spaces it had created that had no furniture yet because no prior experience had produced the furniture for them. He was not, he understood, the same man who had stood at the railing in the dark and felt the thing he hadn't been able to call anticipation. He didn't know yet what man he was. That accounting would take longer than the island had given him, and it would happen somewhere else, somewhere without the wind and the limestone and the ocean directly below, and he would have to do it with the tools available to him at the time, which might or might not be adequate to the task. He would find out. He would have to find out. Dolan spoke. There'll be mop-up, he said. The caves on the south slope. 3-4 days minimum. I know. After that, he stopped. He appeared to be considering whether to finish the sentence or leave it where it was. He left it where it was. Ellery understood. After that was a different problem from the current problem, and the current problem hadn't been fully resolved, and the habit of infantry survival was to address the problem in front of you before you speculated about the problem following it. This had been the operating principle of 22 days. It had served them as well as anything could have been expected to serve them. It was not a philosophy he was eager to abandon. He put his hand in his breast pocket. Empty. The cigarette was in the jacket. The jacket was on the girl. He thought about this for a moment. The specific small absurdity of it. The unlit cigarette from Gloucester that had crossed the Pacific in his breast pocket and survived 22 days on Saipan, and the banzai assault of July 7th, and was now in the pocket of a 4-year-old girl's borrowed jacket somewhere west along the cliff line. He thought about whether there was something he was supposed to take from this. He decided there wasn't. Some things that happened in war did not mean anything. They simply happened, and the meaning you assigned them was your own business and not inherent in the event itself. He had learned this. The island had been patient about teaching it. He looked at the cave shot marks on the limestone across from his position, the pale scars in the rock where rounds had hit, the fresh white against the gray and weathered face of the cliff. The island would keep those marks. The limestone would carry them without complaint, without annotation. The way limestone carried all marks, the erosion of the water and the wind and the slow geological processes that had built these cliffs over 10,000 years before anyone put a flag on them. Long after the Marines and the Japanese Army and the civilian population and the transport ships and the naval gunfire were gone, the cliff would be here with its marks, and the ocean would continue against its base, and the wind would move through whatever grew back in the place of the broken palms. Some places, Ellery thought, did not let you take everything you brought to them back out again. He had brought things to this island. Certain ways of understanding the world, certain operating assumptions about the relationship between action and outcome, certain beliefs about what he was capable of and what he was not capable of, and where the line between those things was drawn. The island had taken some of those things, and he would not be getting them back. He understood this. He would not get Watts back. He would not get the version of himself that had stood at the ship's railing back. He would not get the particular quality of sleep that did not contain the things that would now always be in it. What he would get was the morning, the pale blue sky that the horizon was offering to anyone who would accept it. The sound of the ocean against the base of the cliff, which was a sound without agenda, without memory, without any particular stake in what had happened on the limestone above it. He would get the girl walking toward the woman in the dark dress. He would get Reyes's dry voice saying, "I'm aware." He would get Dolan sitting at the right distance beside him in the silence that followed the last shot, offering presence without intrusion, which was its own form of knowledge about what men needed from each other after the things that could not be talked about yet. These were the things he was taking out. He was taking them out on the same legs that had carried him in, across the same reef in the same ocean, through the same indifferent blue water, and he was going to have to figure out somewhere else what to do with all of it. He stood up. His boots were wet. The cold was thorough. His right cheekbone, where the heel of the hand or the fist had caught him, was beginning to ache now that the adrenaline had finished with it. A low, persistent throb that would be worse tomorrow and gone in a week. He picked up his rifle. He looked south, at the broken terrain the assault had come through, and spent itself against, at the limestone ridgelines and the shattered cane and the cave mouths still blinking their intermittent muzzle flashes in the morning light, at the island that had been eating men alive since June 15th and would continue to eat them for 3 or 4 more days until the last position was reduced, and the last cave was silent, and the thing was finally, technically, over. He looked north, at the ocean. The wind moved through what remained of the palms behind him. The broken trunks, and the few survivors still standing with their crowns intact, rattling in the salt wind, with the specific sound that palms made, a sound he would hear for the rest of his life, and in which, for the rest of his life, he would hear this particular morning. Some places don't let you leave whole. Even if you walk away. He walked away.